Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. We'll do a quick round of introductions and run down the line here and then get into some questions. Want to make sure everyone's getting that coffee in, though, because we're going to open it up to the audience for some questions a little later on. So we'll see how well y'all are paying attention this morning and waking up. My name is Hamilton Boggs. I'm a partner with McKinsey and Company. I'm based out of our Rocky Mountain office in Denver, and I lead all of our public sector efforts across what we refer to as the Rocky Mountain region, but really includes a larger swath of the West than just the Rocky Mountains. And it's been a real privilege to be able to work alongside state and local leaders on some of these topics that we're going to be talking about today. A lot of the work that we are in conversations with the state and local governments around are related to infrastructure because it's a big challenge. So whether it be water, broadband, transportation, energy, these are things that are top of mind. And I'm really fortunate to be able to support those leaders across all of those topics. So delighted to be here. My plan is to not talk much and to let these experts give you their guidance and expertise, and I'll let them introduce themselves.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm Alexis Pelosi. I am the Senior Advisor for Climate in the Office of the Secretary at HUD, Housing and Urban Development. I also am a reformed land use attorney, so I spent 20 years entitling residential, commercial, retail projects in Northern California. And so this topic is very near and dear to my heart. At HUD, our mission is to create strong, sustainable communities and affordable housing for all. And so we do that through a number of programs that I'm sure many folks in this room are very familiar with. Things like our Community Development Block Grants, or CDBG, which provides funding to over 1,200 states and municipalities across the country, money that can be used to support infrastructure investments. We also have a great program, our Section 108 loan program, which tiers off of our CDBG funding and allows local municipalities and grantees to be able to leverage their CDBG funds 5 times to be able to make investments within their communities. And a lot of those dollars actually also go towards infrastructure investments. Earlier this year, we recently announced our Pathways to Removing Obstacles Housing Awards, which is a new program that we just stood up. And that program in particular awards funds to help communities to remove barriers to providing more affordable housing, including gaps in the development process, deteriorating infrastructure, lack of neighborhood amenities, et cetera. It's a very popular new program. We're about to make our second round of awards under that. And just to give an example of some of this additional funding that is available. Unfortunately now, with the second round of awards, we are waiting for the next appropriations for any future funding that may be available, but just to put it in folks' head, in Hawaii, Hawaii received $6.6 million to specifically develop infrastructure and infrastructure financing mechanisms to increase the supply of affordable housing. And also in Ketchum, Idaho, to update the comprehensive plan to better align with current policies and their current housing action plan, transportation plans, and other things. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation because not only does HUD have a lot of resources, but over the past few years, what we've really been doing with all of the new funding that's come down under the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the CHIPS Act, and other new funding opportunities is working across the federal family to break down silos and barriers and to create new technical assistance products and resources to help and to support communities in being able to access those funds to make those infrastructure investments. So really looking forward to this conversation.
Hey everyone, my name is Sean Berens. I'm Deputy General Counsel to Governor Katie Hobbs down in Arizona. Before that, also a reformed attorney of sorts. I'm still an attorney in some respects, but I have a focus. I had a real estate transactional practice before I joined the governor's office, and I have a focus on natural resources, housing, and water policy primarily. So in addition to the federal funding streams that I will not get into much because Alexis is next to me, I think a big part of my role and my boss's role is to create the environment of foreseeability where private investment actually feels that they can make very large long-term investments in our state for housing or for other projects. And to that end, if you've been around folks from Arizona, they may do this ad nauseum, but I wanted to just highlight the TSMC project because I think it's really applicable to housing. Specifically, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is building, they're almost done with the first one, building 3 chip fabs in Arizona. It's the largest foreign direct investment in the history of the United States. And that really happened because of coordination at all levels of government in a way that is just directly applicable to housing, I think. It was the economic development arm of the state government, the Arizona Commerce Authority, and the Economic Development Office in the city of Phoenix going to them and saying, hey, you have an amazing facility to build chips in Taiwan. Here is our site on state land to do a massive greenfield development so that not only will your fabs get built, but all of your suppliers, these folks who have grown up around you in Taiwan, they can all come and be there as well. And here's where they can live. So that was, I think the exciting thing about that is it didn't take coordination of a lot of people. It's just a very small number of human beings who needed to get on the same page to land this massive project. So the city of Phoenix gave some foreseeability with regard to what kind of water treatment is going to be required up there. They're going to do a direct potable reuse water treatment facility called Toilet to Tap by not me, but others. And it's going to be state of the art. And that was known before people made the investments in the TSMC facility, but also the surrounding area. So it could be planned for, even though it's going to be an expensive facility. And then it's on state land, and the surrounding area was state land as well. And we did an auction where we had a massive investment from a New York firm where we basically said, okay, the upfront cost of this land isn't going to be as much because we're going to participate with you going forward. So you're going to build this infrastructure, but the amount that is due to us shifts based on how much participation you get from local government in building the backbone, sewer, water, et cetera, and streets infrastructure. So that was all thoughtfully done by a limited number of human beings. It wasn't a Herculean coordination task. It just takes a few people knowing each other, and it's directly applicable to housing because we did the exact same thing with a purely residential project in a different part of Metro Phoenix. So I think the coordination is very doable, and that's my takeaway from those.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Cameron Diehl, and I'm the Executive Director of the Utah League of Cities and Towns, and we represent 1,400 mayors and council members at the state capitol and provide advocacy and training for them and for senior city staff across the great state of Utah. By a quick show of hands, how many of you are on campus here at the University of Utah for the first time? Quite a few of you. Well, perfect. I'm a University of Utah grad. I did my undergrad here. My dad did his undergrad here, and both of us were Hinckley Institute interns back in the day. But I want to emphasize something about that back in the day. You are in very nice digs right now. These digs did not exist when I was a student here. My last classes here at the Hinckley Institute were back in 2006. And a lot has changed in Utah since 2006. And I mentioned that my dad was a Hinckley Institute intern. Well, he went to the same building that I went to, and then my family actually goes all the way back to the pioneer days, and we're among the first wagon trains to come across the West. And infrastructure meant something totally different in 1847. Back then it was a hand cart or a covered wagon over a dirt trail compared to the infrastructure that we have today. But even fast forwarding to 2006, when I was last a student here at the Hinckley Institute, back then we had some light rail lines, but Utah did not have an 80-mile front runner commuter rail that connected the Wasatch Front. There were several freeways that did not exist back in 2005, 2006. We had just expanded I-15 courtesy of the Olympics. So thank you to the federal government for the partnership for the 2002 Winter Olympics. But Utah was just being discovered because of the Olympics. And the good news from all that growth that we've seen over the last nearly 20 years is When I was a student here, Real Salt Lake had just arrived and would play in front of a half-empty crowd, myself included, at Rice Eccles Stadium down the road here. Now they have a beautiful new stadium. Well, it's not even new anymore, but a beautiful stadium that has its own light rail stop right off of I-15. We now have an NHL team, sorry about that, but not really, that plays downtown. And you've seen a lot of tremendous growth in not just downtown Salt Lake, but across the region. In fact, to put numbers on it, when I was a student here in 2006, Utah had about 2.5 million people, and right now Utah has about 3.5 million people. Now, that story is not unique to Utah. My grandfather on my mom's side was the mayor of a small town in Idaho, Glenns Ferry, Idaho. Do I have anybody here from Idaho? Well, that is unfortunate. I had a whole bunch of Idaho stuff ready to go. I'll summarize it just by this. I was in Idaho over the summer visiting some family, and my grandparents who lived in that small town would talk about going to the big city of Boise, and Boise is not my grandparents' Boise. Boise has exploded. And I went to kind of a swanky food hall with my cousin and thought, this is not the Boise I remember. And I thought it was awesome. It was a great downtown environment. And then where my cousins live in Nampa, it used to be a bunch of farms with a few houses. Now it's a bunch of houses with a few farms. And that's the story across the West. I went to grad school in Colorado. Anybody from Colorado? I prepared a whole bunch of regional material. Okay, so several of you from Colorado. I was there over the summer visiting some friends too, and I was driving on 470. And when I went to school there, 2007 to 2010 in law school, the airport was in Nebraska, and there was nothing for a while until you got to Denver. Well, the airport is still in Nebraska, but now you've got a whole bunch of development between the airport and Denver. And it's because the West has been discovered. And people, not just from the rest of the country, but from all over the world, want the quality of life that we have here in the West. And that brings some really unique challenges from City Hall all the way up to the state capitol as we try to navigate those challenges. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation because at the end of the day, infrastructure really is quality of life. And local government, who we represent at the League of Cities and Towns, are really in the quality of life business. And that's infrastructure, it's public safety, it's everything that goes into it. And how do we plan in a way that preserves the quality of life of today's residents and tomorrow's residents?
They'll always be the Coyotes to me.
Thanks, Cam. I'm Brennen Brown. I'm a managing director at DA Davidson and appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel. I run a team at DA Davidson called the Development Finance Group. Our role is to work with private sector developers and also public sector clients like cities and towns and figure out how to pay for infrastructure. So we raise capital in the capital markets for development projects, many of which are housing projects. And so we're kind of at the intersection of trying to solve problems, and most of the problems come down to infrastructure. And so, a lot of perspective on what is limiting growth or stopping growth or, infrastructure, how we can, make sure that it's done in a smart way and was mentioned earlier in a coordinated way. And I know Cam just said all the way from, town hall up to the state capitol, but really it goes up to the federal level as well. When you think about infrastructure, the cost of infrastructure is significant, and when you look across the West, and our franchise is a national franchise, but I focus really on the West and specifically Intermountain West. The growth has been so quick in such a short period of time that we're undersupplied from a housing perspective. So when you talk about infrastructure, it's no longer at the town hall level that's going to solve it. We have to think bigger, and we have to make bigger investments. So coordinating from the federal level all the way to the local level, I think, is extremely critical to getting the right types of infrastructure in that will allow the housing and other development we need to keep up with the growth that we're experiencing. So look forward to the discussion today.
Thanks so much. Great to have you all here. I want to start by picking up a thread that kind of permeated around this notion of planning, right? And planning can be challenging, both kind of foreseeing the future and what could be, but then also rallying the stakeholders and making sure that you actually build the roadmap. What are the challenges that need to be overcome in terms of planning around infrastructure for the future, specifically as it relates to affordable housing?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I think, from the federal government's perspective and from HUD's perspective, obviously there's a lot of money that is flowing right now from the federal government down to state and local governments and into individual projects. I think that there also are a lot of different technical assistance and grants and planning funding that has been part of that, new funding opportunities that have come down. I think the important part of any sort of planning and discussions, as we've sort of all alluded to, is making sure that we are breaking down the silos, and that includes not only at the federal government, but at the state and the local, to make sure that all voices are heard and are at the table. When you're thinking about planning, and especially when it comes to housing and affordable housing, making sure that as you're reaching out to communities and as you're reaching out to stakeholders, that all voices are heard. And I know that there's a lot of new technical assistance that has been provided to help and make sure that as that planning is happening, that you are reaching into communities and bringing out the right voices. Obviously, everyone has their unique role to play, and so the breaking down of the silos can be challenging. And so I think that some of the new funding that has come down can help and support that through the planning grants, so from a high level.
So perhaps because we're in the midst of it right now, but my mind immediately goes to what happens when you have a plan and there are unforeseen circumstances. How do you incorporate that into your when you're in maybe a race, basically? And an example we had in Arizona is we do groundwater modeling out to 100 years and guarantee every homeowner that they're going to have an assured water supply for 100 years. I think we're the only ones who do that. So if you hear that we don't have water, it's climate doomerism. It's not true. But we do that, and in our projection, we came up short in like year 98, basically. So that means that certain development can't go forward until we resolve that problem. And I think, and so we're talking about billions of dollars of investment in new housing that is slowed by that, or even stopped in some limited cases. And we need to, there needs to be confidence that we'll address that in a way that recognizes the investments that have been made and gets us back to shovels in the ground as soon as possible. And so I think having those established relationships so that people know you're going to deal with them equitably and then actually doing it is extremely important.
I'm a planning nerd, but I think here in Utah we have a tremendous story to tell. And Meg, I want you to report this back to Andrew, that I'm going to brag about the unified plan for transportation that we have here in Utah. If you remember nothing else from what I say here, remember Unified Plan for Transportation, Google it, because I think it has been a phenomenal illustration of collaboration, not just today, but for 20 years looking back and for 30 years looking forward. The Unified Plan for Transportation that we have here in Utah has brought together the stakeholders ranging from the Department of Transportation, the Utah Transit Authority, counties, cities, other state leaders, federal partners, all coming together to figure out what are the transportation needs that we have in the state, where are those transportation needs, working through the metropolitan planning organizations that we have, because most of the population in Utah is concentrated along the Wasatch Front here. What roads do we need? What transit do we need? What bike lanes do we need? How do we pull all this together in one global plan? And then how are we going to pay for it? And then which funding streams are we going to use to pay for it? Now, the good news is that unified plan gets updated every few years. It's a massive undertaking, but there's a lot of buy-in from political leaders. And it has actually been manifested in the buy-in you get from the general public. Because at the end of the day, regardless of who the governor is, or regardless of who is in elected office, the power comes from the people. And it's their money that's being invested. And again, I've said before, we're in the quality of life business. Residents, when they are, you can't message your way out of traffic on I-15. And they know there's more traffic today than there was 20 years ago. So we've got to be able to come back to them and say, yes, we're growing, but here's the plan for how we're going to build the infrastructure to ensure your quality of life. The Unified Transportation Plan has done that. So that Unified Transportation Plan outlines all the needs for the next 25 to 30 years. And every city in the metro area has been able to participate and say, here's where we see the needs 5, 10, 20, 30 years from now. Now, only about 2/3 of this plan is funded either from current funding streams or expected funding streams. So there's still a big unanswered question. That's I guess you could call it the bad news, but it's really the uncertain news is how are we going to fund this going forward? Now in Utah, we have a variety of funding streams that we've invested into transportation infrastructure specifically. I can talk about pipes in a little bit, but in the transportation space, we use a variety of federal funds, gas tax. Utah is one of the few states that has a road usage charge program right now that we hope is going to help resolve some of these challenges going forward. That's in addition to our current state gas tax. We have state sales tax that the legislature has earmarked for transportation. That happened about 15 years ago and has been a really big deal for us to stay on top of a lot of transportation investments because the legislature, and I do think this was wise of them. Yes, they handcuffed themselves to a degree with flexibility, but they also made it a priority for their investment. And so they dedicated sales tax dollars. And then they've provided to cities and counties several different financing tools that we can impose. And that looks a little different depending which urban county you're in. But that unified plan has been the backbone to be able to go to residents and say, yes, we're increasing your sales tax, but we're increasing the sales tax in order to pay for these types of infrastructure projects. And the biggest one, going back to my time here at the Hinckley Institute, 2006, we were right at that time going through a massive public information effort, asking the public to support a sales tax increase that ultimately led to the creation and funding of 3 light rail lines that connected the region. And the public supported it. And they supported it because of the planning that went into it, because of the coordination between mayors, council members, state leaders, and the private sector, and we were ultimately successful. In 2015, we did it again. We had an additional sales tax quarter. And I've mentioned government quite a bit because those are my clients, but a key stakeholder here really was the business community. And both in that third quarter, we refer to as the third quarter here, and the fourth quarter, it was actually the business community that was out front and center saying, we need this to be competitive. We need this for the economic benefit for the region. We need everyone to pay more in taxes so that we can invest. And here's the plan. So it's not just raise taxes and trust us. It's here's the plan that we've been working on for years, that we're updating every 5 years. And ultimately, in most areas, the residents were able to get on board. So that unified plan and that emphasis around transportation planning, I think, has really paid dividends here in Utah.
So I'd love to just add kind of a +1 on what you said, Cameron. We just had an election to renew a sales tax.
Is this the Maricopa County one?
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And that required the legislature to go and authorize the county to do this coordinated plan that, again, was really spearheaded by the business community. And it got 58+% of the vote to keep a tax in place. And I don't know how much you all know about Arizona, but there's not much that gets 58% on a ballot in Arizona. So it really is true that people will vote for that, will vote for their quality of life, and it's going to help with roadways, help with traffic congestion, but it's also going to maintain our light rails, among many other things. So they will vote for it if they can see what it's going to do.
Brennen, maybe I'm going to come to you and let you answer this planning question, but maybe just one layer that I want to put on top of it. We actually surveyed, we're doing some work on sustainable, affordable housing in Colorado. We surveyed 200 folks that are kind of in and of the ecosystem. Number 3 on their list for most challenging areas was infrastructure. But I'm wondering if you all can guess what number 1 and 2 were.
Energy and transportation?
Not quite. It is public funding was number 1. 97% said that they needed more access, easier access to public funding. And then 94% said that it was a major challenge, access to equity funding. I'm wondering what you see in terms of what you are, the investments that you're reviewing, kind of how you're thinking about providing financing for some of these projects, what you want to see in terms of planning, and what would make a major difference in terms of unlocking some of that those resources to invest in these projects?
Yeah, really good question. So I think a couple of answers I'd give to that is first, the investment community wants certainty, right? And so we mentioned this actually before as panelists, but it's really hard to get capital to flow when there's uncertainty. And so we have to have certainty from an entitlement, from an infrastructure perspective. You know, all of these things need to be in place in order for capital to flow. If one of those things is missing, there's going to be too much perceived risk and the capital won't flow. So I think, you know, getting back to the planning question, if you can provide certainty to the private markets, to the financial markets, then the capital will flow. And it takes a lot of coordination and planning to kind of put all of those pieces together. I think the second thing I would say is if you look at development in general, most of the easy and cheap stuff has been developed, right? And so we're at a point now where it is a little more complicated and it is a little more nuanced and it does take a little more planning and coordination. And so when you think about the challenges of some of the growth in the areas that we're growing into, it's expensive to do it, and there's challenges in a variety of ways as it relates to infrastructure and other things. And so, again, I think when you're talking about planning, you have to have a vision. You have to have leadership. I think, you know, Governor Cox has put out a, you know, goal to build 35,000 affordable housing units in Utah, and I'm not as familiar as the other states, but I'm sure other leaders have visionary goals. That's a very ambitious goal. There's all sorts of challenges to getting there, but I think you have to have a vision and some bold ideas, and then you can make a plan around that. And so I would encourage, you know, public sector, especially, you know, political leaders to understand the issues and put out a bold vision so that the proper planning can be done to achieve it. I think the TSMC is a great example. If you just go up the map geographically, I mean, in Utah, there's Texas Instruments that has a very similar package. You keep going up north, Micron has a very similar package outside of Boise. I don't think the same level of planning has been done in either of those projects, but there's a massive opportunity to do that if we can bring the stakeholders together. I like what you mentioned in a smaller group. I think not to say that we don't want to do things with public input and with a broad set of stakeholders, but sometimes it's easiest to get things done when there's a group of people who can really cut through the layers to focus on those issues. Yes, I'm not. Yes. So, anyways, those are a couple of my thoughts.
Yeah. And then if I can just jump in too. So with a lot of the federal funds that come down, there are different planning requirements. So again, with our CDBG funds, there's a consolidated plan that all grantees need to prepare every 5 years. There's an annual plan, then every 5 years you update the plan. Similar requirements under money that you get from the Department of Transportation, that you get from the Department of Energy, that you may get from FEMA. And so I think part of the big coordination that needs to happen is the conversation around how all of those plans speak to each other. And so HUD has been working really closely with FEMA on some of the hazard mitigation, the hazard plans that all states need to prepare, as well as then the impact around the housing plans that also need to be prepared. And so then you're having a conversation about where your housing is in relation to your hazards and thinking about housing in advance of those types of disasters that may end up happening. And similar types of conversations to happen across state and local governments around how all of the plans talk to one another and how housing can be such a critical component to that. When you think about the investments that are being made under the CHIPS Act in these manufacturing plants, to think holistically, not only what are the infrastructure needs in order to build those, but then what are the housing needs around it? And then what sort of unintended consequences may you have in terms of displacement and other things if you aren't forward thinking about the housing and the planning that you need to do with that?
One of the things that's coming to mind for me is like, it's not just the chicken or the egg and which comes first. It's like, is it the coop? Is it the electricity to warm them? Is it the feed? Is it the water? How do you think about the prioritization around some of these infrastructure investments when many times there's a competition for some of the funds that are available? How do you think about prioritizing the investments to get the highest return on those investments?
I mean, you can't do one at a time.
Yeah.
I think it's really, you have to do everything at once. And as far as prioritizing one or the other, some are more expensive than others at different times. We've seen challenges to our grids from new demands from data centers or whatever they might be. Yeah, you got to kind of run in place to stay where you're at. Run as fast as whatever the Red Queen analogy is. Yeah.
I mentioned that back in 2006, Utah's population was 2.5 million, and now we're at 3.5 million. I also mentioned that we enacted sales taxes to pay for the expansion of light rail lines. Well, when we did that back in the mid-2000s, what we were not as intentional about back then was what should the planning be around those transit stops. Well, I want to give a shout out to the Governor Cox's senior advisor on housing, Steve Waldrop. Steve was in the legislature before several years ago, and we worked together in a collaborative way to say, how do we rethink these transit stops? Because we have this backbone of infrastructure, and there were transit-oriented developments that were popping up, and I think each individual city was looking at their transit stop. But how do we take the unified plan for transportation and then take it to that next level of planning to really maximize that infrastructure investment? Because there's just not enough money to go around, and we can't go out tomorrow and double our light rail system. So how do we maximize those existing assets? Well, within that unified plan for transportation, we also have what's called Wasatch Choice. And again, Google that term. So I guess now you have two things that you need to Google. But the Wasatch Choice is really the strategy. So you've got the vision of this is what the region's going to look like. Then you have Wasatch Choice, which is these are the strategies and the tactics we're going to use. And one of those key pieces is how do we develop town centers where you can accommodate a lot more housing because you have the transportation network there. Great. So then the next step is the planning piece. And what Steve, as a legislator, did, working in collaboration with us, was to say we recognize that the best planning really does occur on the local level because you're engaging with residents. That's also the hardest planning because you're engaging with residents. So they go together. So let's respect the role of local government in the planning, but let's also recognize that there are some overarching objectives that we need to achieve with this light rail system and bus rapid transit system. And so the state set some key objectives around housing affordability, around transportation connectivity, around environmental sustainability, and around access to economic opportunity and educational opportunity. It said these are the objectives. And now local governments figure out how you're going to meet these objectives and then coordinate them with your fellow cities through the metropolitan planning organizations. How many of you flew into Salt Lake City International Airport? Right, okay. How many of you took the train? Oh, I was really hoping there'd be more hands. Nevertheless, there's a train station at Salt Lake International Airport. It doesn't make any sense to put housing at that train stop. It makes a ton of sense to have housing through the light rail network as you're coming up to campus. And if any of you have ridden the train on 4th South, back when I was a student, there was no housing on 4th South. And now 4th South is filled with housing. And that's all been infill development because of the planning efforts on the local government part and the market responding and the infrastructure investment that came from the residents, local governments, and state government. So all those pieces have come together. And what we ultimately enacted was legislation that required cities to do what's called station area plans. But those station area plans are really an effort to implement the strategies that we've all agreed on through Wasatch Choice and the unified plan. And what we're seeing now are, over the last couple of years since that bill's come into place, we are seeing updates in local plans that are going to accommodate significantly more housing. And let me just give you one example of that. In addition to the stationary plans, we also have worked on some tax increment financing concepts to try to spur the investment in those areas. One of those tax increment financing tools is called an HTRZ, Housing Transit Reinvestment Zone. So those are taking place within stationary plans near transit. 7 of those HTRZs have been approved thus far. Just in those 7 areas near these transit stops, we estimated, and Meg, check my numbers if I get these wrong, but we estimated that but for the tax increment financing to invest in the infrastructure, those areas probably would have had about 15,000 housing units near those 7 stops. right? That's 15,000. Okay. You didn't do the math, that's right. But the estimate was about 15,000 on the 7 stops. We're now estimating that because of that tax increment financing, we're going to be able to accommodate more than double that number of housing units. And there are a couple of areas where you're going to have a lot of housing near these transit stops that, but for the planning, but for the tax increment financing, but for the investment in transit, but for the certainty that comes from that for developers, you would not have had that sort of high intensity development. Now, residents are always concerned about change, and they're concerned about traffic, and they're concerned about those negative impacts on quality of life. But if you ask those same residents, does it make sense to have a lot of high impact development near transit? They're going to say yes. So now again, we're trying to fit into this win-win where we're maximizing the investment. We can say to residents, this is where the high impact development should go. We're going to accommodate a lot of housing. And as part of those tools, a percentage of those housing units need to be affordable, deed restricted affordable, and we need to try to figure out how to get ownership units in there. And so we're trying to put all of these pieces together to provide certainty on the funding side and on the planning side so that the private markets can respond and private developers can build, and we maximize all of these pieces.
Thanks. Sean, I want to come back to something that you said, which is we need to do it all, right? And often all of that, or much of that, falls on the folks that are building the units to provide for the infrastructure, right? So because it has to happen all at once, all of that kind of falls on them. Is that the right expectation? Is that the right model for us to have? And I'd love to hear from, Brennen and Alexis as well.
Short answer, no. I mean, not completely anyway. I think growth theoretically is supposed to pay for itself. It's not supposed to pay for everybody else too. I think that there are innovative ways to do some of this stuff. Certainly, I just learned they're called PIDs here, but community facilities districts. These mechanisms where the homeowners, if it's housing is built, can pay through taxes for you're paying long-term for long-term assets. There's a lot of coordination that can happen even on the private side with participation in these more regional infrastructure facilities. So maybe one development builds a wastewater treatment facility, but as people come in, they can get paid back for that by the development that surrounds it, that serves it. But you have to do other things. There's the city of Phoenix just did its first major bond in 15 years, which is probably not the cadence you want. That was a little bit Great Recession related, but and they're using that bond to do a lot of infrastructure improvements in addition to putting like 60 million or so to affordable housing. So you got to use all those mechanisms, and it shouldn't just fall on new development. And the other thing is, like, new development, part of what they need, as has been mentioned, is certainty. And so if I am going to do an infill project and I think that I'm putting in this kind of water infrastructure, and oh no, you want me to upsize that for like not a fair reason, that's going to completely blow my pro forma. And that's one of the reasons we don't get workforce in affordable housing. So there has to be foreseeability in that, and there has to be a commitment to finding other sources of capital for infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we need a unified transportation plan. We need a unified power plan. We need a unified water plan. We need a unified sewer plan. Like, there are so many pieces of infrastructure that we need to serve the level of development or housing that we need to produce to fill the gaps that we're at. And so I think, like Cam said, our state's done a lot of great things, and I think there's a lot of great things we can do even beyond that. And so when you're trying to attract the private markets and you're trying to figure out how to pay for infrastructure, that pendulum swings. and it's swung. If you look 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago, the amount of money the private sector puts up, meaning developers versus, local entities like towns and counties, cities, that pendulum swings back and forth. If you look back through the decades, I think the challenge we have now is if you need to put in a $50 million wastewater treatment plant to open up a region to build some housing, there's no single housing developer that can fund a $50 million treatment plant. That just destroys a pro forma. No one can bear that cost. So what ends up happening is they will, that treatment plant is the right solution for that area. No single developer has the ability to do that. Cities and counties are tapped out. So what you end up having is you put Band-Aids on, and they'll do, they won't build the treatment plant. They'll expand a current one that just allows 200 more homes to go in, and so again, I think we have to think a little bigger and have a unified transportation plan, a unified power plan, not only for generation, but for transmission of power, and then sewer and water, so that some of these things can be funded at with state or federal dollars, and then more of the local infrastructure to get to individual communities can be borne by the development community. So I definitely think it falls on both. If it all falls on one, then I think we get outcomes that aren't ideal. We'll get an outcome that will allow the 200 homes to be built, but if you're trying to put in 2,000, it's much better to think and plan a little better. It's just figuring out how to put the cost of that in up front. That's the challenge, and that gets back to the planning and the coordination.
Yeah, and something that you said is really interesting, right? Like, sometimes the developer can do an investment of that size, but that's only if it's a large enough project and it's all connected. So the only way you're going to do a large project like that is if okay, in 20 years, when I'm not even quite approaching build out of my project, there will still be water or there will still be energy. So you got to give that foreseeability in order for people to invest.
And then I'll just jump in. I mean, I think, the comment around planning and the certainty is very important. And I think that also, as you think about the new funding opportunities that have come down from the federal government, the collaboration and the forming of regional teams with the strategy and approach around whatever that project may be, that strengthens the application process for receiving those various federal grants, because that coordination and that long-term thinking is certainly something that as you're looking at applications and scoring, depending on what the particular grant program is, it's important to look at. So to think about how you're collaborating and planning together through these, coordinated or consolidated type plans across different topic areas is important, I think, of being competitive for those different grants. And there also are a lot of different technical assistance resources that have come down recently from the federal government. So there's the Thriving Communities Network. There's a technical assistance program that stood up across the United States. Different federal agencies also have their own technical assistance programs that can help with some of this coordination and planning. There's some great examples of that, that happy to share.
Yeah, Hamilton, if I can just add one more comment, just maybe that will help people visualize it. For people that went to the Daybreak site visit yesterday, Daybreak 20 years ago felt like it was a little bit out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, now you laugh at that comment, but that development was closing 1,000 homes a year at its peak. If we're 35,000 units short, think about that. We need 10 Daybreaks at once in order to fill this gap, right? And so we have to figure out where to go do that. And that's a big challenge. And then you pair that with all of the things Cam said about, building along transit lines, more infill development. Obviously, greenfield development, suburban housing isn't the way forward to fill all 35,000 of the gap, but you have to have all of the pieces. You have to have greenfield development, you have to have infill development, you have to go vertical. All of those things need to come together to provide a variety of housing options to fill these shortages that we're facing.
Yeah. Audience, I'm going to open it up in just a second to you all for any questions that are top of mind that you'd like the panel to weigh in on. But just to pick up on that last thread, some of the research that we've done in Colorado, there's like 3,000 additional units that need to be built every year in order to try and kind of close that gap. Currently, we are at 2.05% growth rate is what the need is, and that is actually, we're at 1% growth rate. The pre kind of financial crisis level was a 1.5% growth rate. So we're talking about not just a getting back to where we were kind of in a pre-financial crisis world, but a step change beyond that. And it really is going to take the kind of collaboration, coordination that y'all are talking about in order to jumpstart this and make sure that we can catch up. All right, audience members. Yes, right here. We have a roaming mic by Lauren.
I think my question will mostly go for Sean in Arizona, but I think anybody else might weigh in as well. So in Arizona, you are our fourth driest state in the West. You are also on the Colorado River at a very tough pinch point. I just went to Colorado River Water Users Association last week.
I'm in the upper basin. Please let me go back home after.
And it's painful, what the choices that you guys are having to make there in Arizona. You also have laws there that are geared towards making sure that you can develop in a thoughtful way. New York Times, I think a few other media entities, were talking about water in the West, and they pointed to that as a failure, which frustrated me to no end, because this is important that we recognize the limitations of our water as we are developing. And you just talked about how you're trying to manage that. So I've been thinking, I have family and friends in Arizona. Also, I work for the Western States Water Council, so this is a West-wide issue, just so you know what you're dealing with. I think that Arizona is a good example of you guys are in the crossfire of figuring out how to do development in water. You have people who are embracing hardcore things like water reuse in order to allow that development to go forward. You also have maybe grandfathered type communities that think they're very anti-government, and they think that it's a government conspiracy to pretend that there's not enough water. And you're dealing with both. You're also dealing with tribes that are willing to lease their water rights in order to make the existing development continue to succeed. How do you manage continued development when you are limited in your water resources?
Sure. So first off, just a short rant about the New York Times. Okay. I'm a total lefty. Okay, but I will just say. We announced, we have this tool, this 100-year assured water supply. We're the only folks who model out that far in an official way. And we said, and the point of the tool is it sends an alarm bell, start to ringing if we think any time in that 100 years there'll be unmet demand in any of our protected sectors, which includes housing. So we said, okay, there's a shortfall at the very end of that period, and so we need to pause some development to get the solution before we go forward, because when we say you have an assured water supply as a homeowner, we mean it. That is the gold standard, and we have an exemplary, when it comes to groundwater, an exemplary regulatory tool that's been studied globally to make sure that happens. So the New York Times releases a multi-thousand-word article about it mere minutes after we gave them the briefing on what the model actually said. And the second line of the article is, in what could signal the end of development in the West or something like that. And I was on the phone with the editor, and she said, well, that's analysis, so you can't fact check it, it's analysis. So
It's terrible
anyway, yeah, and there's also a daily episode where they say, I look out and there's green grass and taps are gonna run dry soon, which is like, ridiculous. But all of that said, we do have, I don't think there's a lot of people who say there's no water problem, even you talk about anti-government folks or whatever. People who want to be left alone, they still realize that, if there's fissures in the ground, if my well is going dry, it's a problem. So we have really important legislation for rural groundwater management. We're very tight, pretty seriously regulated in our urban areas, but we have some legislation that's going through the legislature this session for a rural groundwater tool that is takes the input of the people in that area into account when they decide on their goals for management and stuff like that. We have scarcity. I just so everyone knows, please remember this forever. Phoenix is at the confluence of 4 rivers. It's not actually in a bad spot, okay? Maybe sprawl needs to be worked on, but it's not actually in a bad spot. But we have a lot of buy-in too, and because of that, because of the challenges we've had in the past, we have a ton of experts. There's a really expert. You talk to developers who are like, it's like you might as well be a water lawyer just because you've been developing here a long time. So that buy-in is going to yield good results. We're in the middle of an important transition from, hey, I'm a developer, I got to go find all my water myself, and then figure out how it's going to be conveyed to the city, to a more regional, like the provider needs to go find the water and use economies of scale to do so. So we're in the middle of that transition. It's a tough transition, but I think that's part of the future is really centralizing, having those economies of scale. Our water infrastructure authority that's going to go get water from outside the state, theoretically, they have an RFI to do that. And then also the providers who are in the forever business will always be there, not just project specific, becoming the people who are really making those long-term investments for the new supplies.
Can I just follow up and say that your neighboring states are not going to like if you want to get water from other states?
Well, sorry, I said out of state. I didn't necessarily say other states. That we also have a border with someone else. But in any event, we want to be collaborative, believe it or not, even on the Colorado River.
Well, in that case, Utah would like our share of the.
Okay, wait, we were here a lot longer. There were more people.
All right.
Prior appropriation. But we want to be collaborative on all those issues, and any long-term water augmentation solution would need the buy-in of basically everybody in the basin, I think.
Maybe time for one more question from the audience.
Hi, Bill Jager. I'm with the Lore Foundation. We work on quality of life issues throughout the rural Mountain West. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the infrastructure challenges unique to rural communities that you are tackling. A lot of great conversation about metropolitan development and the collaboration it requires. But everything from drawing down the federal funds and the capacity it takes to actually do that, to doing things like pre-development assessment and the barriers that rural communities face to accessing the resources to do that, to unlocking private capital markets. I'd be curious if you had thoughts and solutions on rural infrastructure development specific to housing.
I mean, I'll just say generally from the federal government, there was an effort that has been stood up over the past couple of years called the Rural Partnership Network, so RPN, that has all of the different federal agencies that are part of it, that are going out, that are looking at the particular challenges in rural communities and bringing the expertise of the federal government and the various resources that each agency has to those discussions and going into rural communities. There's also, the energy communities. There's a whole effort around that. There's a lot of work that's being done looking at housing in energy communities, and so how to be able to build out more housing and more affordable housing within those communities. And so there are a lot of different resources that I'm happy to share out afterwards to look at, to see what the federal government is doing in terms of making investments in rural communities and helping with some of those infrastructure challenges. And then on tribal communities in particular, there have been a lot of independent streams of resources that have come down for infrastructure, a number of programs from the Department of Energy, from the Department of Agriculture, that are specific to developing energy resources within tribal communities as well as in rural communities.
Yeah, go ahead.
You'll meet Governor Cox later today, and Governor Cox comes from a small town in central Utah. So this issue has been on the forefront for him ever since he initially ran for office. He's a former mayor. I remind him of that all the time. Once a mayor, always a mayor of a small town, about 1,500 people. From a league perspective, we represent cities and towns across the state. And I'm going to give you one example of the collaboration between the state and local governments trying to help rural Utah. In fact, I'll give you one example, and then I'll set the stage for a second example, because you're going to hear from the league's deputy director, Justin Lee, later, who could talk more on the water piece and can go into more detail, but I'll just hit a couple of highlights here. One, when the federal government passed ARPA, that was the first time that money went directly to every city and town in the country. 19,000 cities, towns, and villages got direct allocations. Well, for us, the majority of our membership does not have full-time administrative staff. So they were receiving these dollars for infrastructure, housing, water, sewer, et cetera, but they didn't have the capacity in-house to know what to do with it. So we as a league actually pooled together over 150 of those communities. They gave a portion of their ARPA dollars to us. We hired a staffer who then helped them figure out how to use ARPA in their communities. Additionally, the governor's office, and Laura Hansen's the senior planner for Governor Cox's team here, the governor's office was incredibly responsive working with us. And I guess that's probably my third takeaway of, I mentioned Unified Plan and Wasatch Choice, but really the spirit of collaboration we have here in Utah is tremendous. And ARPA, I think, was a great example of this. The legislature set aside some of their ARPA money, the state ARPA money. And I should also note, when we got CARES Act money, the state shared the entire portion that they were allowed to share with local governments. So again, spirit of collaboration here. But in that ARPA piece, the state set aside $50 million of their money to match local governments' ARPA dollars to make the investments go further. Well, that $50 million went like this. I worked with Laura's team, and we had over 400 applications from local governments, totaling over $1 billion worth of infrastructure asks, and most of them were in rural Utah. So that actually helped give us an inventory of what the need was. And then I mentioned, we had a staffer that was helping those small communities figure out how to use the ARPA dollars. And then that in turn led to a collaborative effort that we think is the first of its kind in the country, where the state is now funding what we call a local administrative advisor program, which is essentially, for lack of a better term, a revolving city manager that can now service lots of small communities across the state. And they're housed at our associations of government. And so we have 7 of those around the state. So now if you go to southeastern Utah, remote southeastern Utah, there is a local administrative advisor that coordinates with us at the league, that's funded by the state, that coordinates with the governor's office, that is providing administrative assistance to small communities like Bluff, population 300, and to communities like Castledale, population 1,300, and communities like Elmo, population 450, and helping them navigate it. The governor's office is also trying to pull together, here are all the grants and dollars that are available through the state, so we can overcome some of those purely administrative barriers. So that doesn't get the money all the way to the end, but it is us trying to tackle that obstacle of small communities just not having the capacity to know what questions to ask, let alone where the funding is, to then get the projects done. And again, we have a great legacy of collaboration. And the collaboration is hard work. The Utah way is special, but it does take a lot of hard work. And I applaud our state leaders for their commitment to it. I applaud our mayors and council members for their commitment to it. It's hard work, but I think Utah's a great place to work, live, and play because of that Utah way of collaboration.
Great, thank you so much. Very important question, and appreciate the reflections. We are just about at time. I am going to start down with Brennen and offer any just kind of quick closing comments or final reflections. We'll run down the panel, and then I think we're standing between you and a break, and so we'll let you refresh your refreshments.
Yeah, I'll be brief then. I think, in short, I'm a huge advocate of putting bold initiatives out there at a leadership level, and then filling in the pieces with the right people to go get the job done. And I think all of these challenges are difficult, but certainly with the right people, there's been a lot of examples spoken about today. We can figure this out, and I'm confident of that, and appreciate the opportunity to be with you all today.
I'll summarize in 2 words that start with P: partnership and planning. Often you have conflicts when, and those of you who work for governors, when the state comes in and tells local government, thou shalt do it this way. But when it's a spirit of partnership, that leads to much better results. When we respect everybody's role, and the role of the private sector and the role of the public, and we respect everybody's role, and we focus on collaboration, focus on outcomes, it leads to better results. And we have big challenges here in Utah, but we have big opportunities, and I'm grateful to be a part of Utah's growth, and I'm part of Utah's journey, and thanks for the opportunity today.
Yeah, I think you said it well. I think collaboration's absolutely key. Partnership is extremely important, and it's it's not, I said this in my opening remarks, but it's not necessarily a Herculean task. It's a relatively limited number of people that need to get on the same page for a given project or whatever, to have those forward-looking discussions to do really great things, whether it's, getting X number of units built in a set time frame or bringing a major employer or something to your state. So absolutely key, and I'm glad that it was spoken about today.
And I just want to say again, thank you so much for having us here today. This has been a great discussion, and I think looking at it from, HUD's perspective, with the hundreds of billions of dollars that have come down over the past couple of years, from HUD's perspective, HUD obviously receives their annual appropriations, but we received $1 billion through all that, through our Green and Resilient Retrofit program. Hundreds of billions of dollars went to other agencies. We've worked very closely with all of those other agencies to talk about the importance of housing, to make sure that housing is part of the conversation as they are making these investments across the United States in infrastructure. Housing is also infrastructure. And so just know from HUD's perspective, we have had a seat at the table. We have been having conversations with those other agencies. There's a lot of technical assistance that I've alluded to. There are a number of ways to be able to find out more about that. That technical assistance can be used to help with capacity building. It can be helped to use to build those coalitions and to be able to identify additional financing that has come down. And so really just know that from the federal government's perspective and from HUD's perspective, we've had a strong seat at the table talking about the importance of housing and the need to have housing as you're making these infrastructure investments. And so just really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about it. And I'll share information about some of the other resources.
Great. Thank you all so much. Let's just show some appreciation for our panelists, their insights and inspiration.